this agnotology, this ignorance, we will either turn away or look to the truth, and perhaps this may dismay some. But I mean, ultimately, if the truth is what you seek and you're curious, weirdly enough to say, you're gonna be okay. But it's this strange phenomena that seems to be polarizing.
It's exceedingly difficult to grapple with nuances and to wrestle with those things. And the less energy our brain has, the more it will just resort to simplifying things, not grappling with the nuance.
No, that's really interesting that you touch on energy. Like it's an energy deficiency. Yes. Very interesting discussion. I almost like this discussion more than the beginning part of this interview.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with Nathaniel, and we connected over the comment section of one of my videos, and we started talking over X. And I've been checking out Nathaniel's YouTube channel, and he makes some really great content on a lot of topics that I'm interested in. And I guess I'll start off by asking you, what made you start to make some of this content and kind of get into this, educating and putting yourself out there to explain some of your thoughts and ideas?
I guess it's been a long time in the making. Even when I was kind of a young kid, I was always interested in, like, what kind of food could I eat that could give me more energy or just make me feel better. I think I did get sick a lot as a child, just like a lot of flus and colds and inflammation. And I got my tonsils out when I was about 7. Just a number of things. I had, my parents suffer from various chronic diseases, and also some of my siblings started to have some allergy issues and such. And about a number of years ago, probably about 3 years ago, and then it accelerated shortly after the year 2020, as we were exposed to a number of different pathogens and pathogen mitigators. I think a lot of my different health issues amplified quite a bit. Perhaps little fires that might have been burning throughout my bodies every here and there, and a bunch of little ones at the same time, but not entirely noticeable. But as I was exposed to perhaps life stressors, an increase in environmental exposures, and toxins in my food and water, I think things just started to accumulate and get to a breaking point. And I started experiencing things like chronic fatigue, and a lot of just like chronic inflammation, food intolerances, and that sort of thing. But I was always kind of making adjustments and making up for these losses of being able to intake certain foods, and because I was always kind of slightly ahead of the curve, slightly behind the curve in changing myself and modifying my routines to be able to fit the changes in how my body was functioning. And so I evaded a lot of pain, but I guess it came at a certain cost, right? It takes a certain amount of research and going to doctor's appointments and things just not getting figured out, and then just general disbelief. Doctors and even the people around you don't exactly understand what's going on inside of your body. And so really you need to be the advocate for yourself and really champion these changes in how you eat. And but the very difficult thing was that everything around me was kind of the same. The culture was the same, and culture of how we treat disease and how we treat symptoms was the same. And I was very frustrated. So I guess how I kind of came into all of this was just a building of frustration at the fact of nothing was changing, not only for me but for a lot of people around me. And so I decided to take matters into my own hands and become a practitioner myself, and start conversations and consulting with people. Um, but first, before I did that, I started creating some online content to try and bring light to some of these lesser discussed issues. Again, like I said, environmental exposures like mold in water damaged buildings, a lot of toxins in water like fluoride, um, and just general mineral deficiencies from glyphosate exposure, um, really creating a lot of, you know, mineral imbalances of all kinds. And so, yeah, I really became fascinated by biological mechanisms and enzymes and the things required to power those enzymes. And that led to my healing. And I started to get more energy, and started to feel better and have less inflammation. And slowly, as I chipped away at my own environmental exposures and got out of a moldy apartment, and changed my diet, changed my lifestyle a little bit, started pursuing some passions that I maybe had on the back burner, my outlook on life started to change, and um, my health improved a lot, and so I I kept running with it, and guess that kind of brings me to where we are today.
Excellent. I think what you have gone through is, I can certainly relate to it. And I think a lot of people can relate to it, especially the frustrations with doctors and professionals not knowing what your issues are. And perhaps they just don't have the right views and attitudes to ever understand what those problems actually are. And then also taking control of your own health. And I'm glad that you did that. And I think that's something that we can both agree on, that it's really important for people to do. And so you touched on a lot of things that hopefully we can get to. Why don't we start with mold exposure? So you said that you experienced mold exposure and that was detrimental to your health. And I know I have had that experience as well, growing up in a moldy home, and it definitely impacts me. Why don't you tell people how that's impacted you, and perhaps we can get into some of the research on what you now know. So not just your personal experiences, but the research and how you understand it today.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, it started just very simple, and I had never throughout my life kind of appreciated. I was always kind of like a bit of a neat freak, and I like keeping things clean, and keeping things dry and such. But when it came to looking deeper at, like, looking at the windowsills, and really looking at the structures of how buildings are made, and the fact that we're dealing with paperback drywall, and poorly insulated wall cavities that might be sealed with caulking, so it creates a perfect like temperature differential and uh, suffocation of oxygen in that area. And so you just got humidity, darkness, and lots of lack of oxygen. It just creates the perfect recipe for mold. And so my personal experience is my wife and I were living in an apartment that had a number of issues with water intrusions. There was a skylight that was leaking. There was a bedroom window that had leaked at one point. There was some issues in the bathroom around the shower caulking and on the outside of it. There was, a sink that had leaked, and then it was also connected. It was a kind of like a side suite on a home, so it was part of a home. And on the other side, there was also After I left, we found out that the owner of the property had been going through their own things on their side of the house and finding leaks under tubs and ripping out other window frames that had black mold in them. And, these are all things hidden behind walls that you can't see. And then sometimes it's not even enough of a leak for it to show up on the other side. So you have a number of these leaks, and although this is an aging home, this can happen in a lot of new construction homes, and even in $1 million mansions. It has mold is an issue that has no discrimination. It will hit on anyone at any income level, if the right precautions are not taken to construct a building in a manner that is, um, proper insulation. The gaps are correct, and you have an air exchange, so you're getting fresh air. Mold essentially just wants to break down things that aren't living anymore, and it wants to destroy pockets where there's no oxygen, because mold sees that as, I mean, if mold had a brain, it sees those things as like not natural, like it's just trying to grow and create natural life, and mold really is a good thing. I mean, you also have aerobic strains of mold that work with oxygen that break things out in the open. And so we're exposed really to mold wherever we go. Um, Even if you're outside or inside. The question is if that mold is pathogenic or not. And so in my personal scenario, I was exposed to a number of pathogenic molds, molds that create mycotoxins. And so you have black molds like aspergillus and stachybotrys that are very common in water damaged buildings. And it's not necessarily that mold itself that is the immediate threat and problem, but once that mold starts to produce things like mycotoxins, like, for example, ochratoxin A, or other kinds of mold toxins. And molds do this kind of when they're under threat, or when they're drying out or dying, or being outcompeted by other strains of mold. And so we had tested, did surface swab samples, we did mycotoxin urine testing, and we found some of these, pathogenic molds and mycotoxins in our environment. And they matched with a lot of the symptomologies we were experiencing. And we were already eating a relatively good diet, and we had pretty good lifestyles. We were living, we were enjoying our lives. We weren't under tremendous amounts of stress. We were doing pretty well, and saving up to purchase a property and build a house, and then um, we got pregnant, and then we had our child after we had left that environment. And so there was a number of things that started before some of the bigger stressors in life occurred. And so, we can kind of isolate that it wasn't necessarily just from stress or bad eating, but that even with the best of care, mold can still affect some of the healthiest people. And there are a number of reasons for that as well. There can be a quarter of the population has genetic variations in their HLA, their human leukocyte antigens, that impair their body's immune response to be able to properly bind to and excrete those toxins. But I believe anyone with any genetic impairment can still live a normal life, even after exposure to mold, if the right steps are taken to enhance that terrain and fix it. So Yeah, as far as personal experience, again, um, histamine intolerance was something that developed. Um, high iron overload slash like inflammation, so high ferritin. Um, inability to digest foods and things like IBS, which kind of goes into food intolerances. So began developing intolerances to gluten, although I wasn't eating really that much of it to begin with. Dairy, many different vegetables, um, especially raw, um, fermented foods, of course, due to the histamine intolerance. Um, Certain neurological issues, such as a lesser ability to manage mood, and kind of impaired cognition. So, brain fog, lack of focus, um, and kind of, those kind of neurological symptoms. And as those things progressed, I kind of, I've been through in circles a few times, so I was like not entirely. At first I never really blamed the mold, and like, it wasn't as I started to read certain literature and get connected with certain people and listening to their education online, such as Dr. Judy Cho, some of the more famous mold doctors like Dr. Richie Shoemaker and Scott McMahon, um, who are a number of others. Eric Dorninger, um, Evan Brand also, and had some chats with Paul Saladino. Evan Brand is a big one as far as mold education. Um, yeah, and as I kind of started to listen to some of their philosophies, and as I would try different things, so adapting how I live my life, and different things of stress, filtering my water, changing my diet, eliminating all like seed oils and excess omega 6s, including not only seed oils but foods high in omega 6 like nuts and seeds, um, and even eating and cooking with no even olive oil or avocado oil. So even the fruit oils, I kind of just eliminated. Um, and even some of the factory farm animals like chickens and pork that contain high omega 6 in their fats, I also eliminated those things. And I started to go through a number of different supplements as well, taking like B complexes and certain types of polyphenols like resveratrol and stuff, and nothing really seemed to fix the situation of all the histamine intolerances and mood dysregulation and brain fog and all of those things. So I really kept circling back to, okay, well, it's not just the food, the water, and stress that I have to consider, but I also need to consider, the air I'm breathing every day, the 10,000 gallons of air, because I mean, that's quite a bit of an exposure. You can even consider exposure of mold in foods, like peanuts might have a lot of aspergillus, right? But the amount of peanuts people are eating on a regular basis aren't really that high in molds relative to our exposure from our environment, if that's in there. So it's kind of a spectrum. You can have a building that has very little mold in it. Obviously, every environment is going to have some form of fungal growth, unless you keep it airtight, dry, with a filtered air exchange and all that such. But I don't think anyone really needs to be that paranoid about mold. It's just really, just keep things, you know, a well constructed home with well insulated windows, no leaky roofs, all the plumbing is intact and the sinks or everything is well caulked, and you maintain the caulking around your tub and shower, and just basic, you keep the humidity under control, and you're good. You're going to have some exposure to fungus when you're outside. Of course, those are going to be less pathogenic because they're going to be the aerobic breathing ones, but you're always going to be exposed to mold. It's just a question of, okay, how much is it in your environment and what's your genetic predisposition? Although I don't like to really give much credit to genetic predispositions, because anyone of any stripe can be affected by mycotoxins.
Yeah, it's probably not good for everybody. And there are definitely, I think it's like 80% of homes. That's what I've heard. 80% of homes have this toxic levels of mold, and so it's a very big problem. And there's lots of people aware of it now today, but still lots of people unaware of it, and who might be listening to what you're saying, thinking, "Oh wait, that's that's me." A lot, like, I mean, I can relate to a lot of what you're saying, but I want to ask you a very particular question, and you might be able to answer this. I haven't really asked many people, but it's kind of a toughie. So I understand that these mold issues weren't a big problem until it was around the 1970s, when they started using a spray chemical on the drywall that was designed to be an antifungal or antimicrobial, um, and work against mold, but it actually made things worse. And
Yes.
yeah, okay, so yeah, so you understand that too. And then so my my question is it possible that, I mean, because you have mold, and mold is a biological creature, and certainly biological creatures can do harm to other biological creatures, but you also have this toxin that is a blatant toxin, and that's the spray that they're putting on the drywall. And if it only really became a big problem after the toxin was added to the picture, is it possible that, similarly to how a vaccine has a biological material to it and an adjuvant to it, where it has, the virus or the bacteria, and then it has the aluminum or mercury as the adjuvant to irritate the immune system, to train, supposedly to train the immune system to attack that biological material? Is it possible that the chemical toxin that they added to the drywall is acting as that adjuvant, that the mold is breaking down that, because like you said, mold is just breaking down decaying material. So the mold is breaking down decaying material. It was always doing that before this toxin was there. Now the toxin is there, it's breaking down decaying toxic material, and breaking that toxic material into very small particles, which are then breathed into the air in uh, alongside mold. So you're breathing in both toxic material and mold. Is it possible that the toxic material is acting as an adjuvant and making our immune system very aggressive towards mold, and that without it, the mold wouldn't be such a problem?
Yes. Well, I think your point is valid, and I think it also goes a few steps deeper as well. So, I mean, what you'll see at the hardware store is you'll see layers of sheetrock, and you'll see the white ones, and then you also see the green mold resistant ones. Those would be the ones you're referring to with the antifungal treatment. Um, and yeah, I don't think that's a good strategy to mitigate. I think it's the strategy to mitigate mold is simply to um, keep the environment controlled and then properly aerated and keep it natural. And that's better. There's also the addition of antifungals to paint as well. So it's not just in the drywall, it's in the paint. And whenever a mold is threatened, it starts to produce mycotoxins. And then this is the issue we were talking about earlier is, so what you're alluding to is, you know, having two things battle you instead of just one, but it's also the fact that like what you're also saying is that it can amplify. So like the mold is now under threat and is producing mycotoxins, and the mycotoxins from the mold is actually the more pathogenic threat to us. Um, and mycotoxins is what produces the immune reaction. Now, it's no question that breathing in these other toxic things and the formaldehyde and the plastics and the carpets and stuff are an issue as well. And you know, that's a whole other environmental exposure when it comes to breathing air in the home. But this is just like at this point, we're creating another problem to tackle another problem that we created just because we just are terrible at taking the time to not cut corners when we're building houses. And yeah, it's, you know, it's really just absurd that, you know, after this much time we haven't figured it out. But I think like the problem started, I think in large part when we started to use paper backed drywall instead of using things like plaster and such, because that thin paper is like, you know, it's spread out throughout the whole wall, and so it's like this perfect petri dish to, if it ever were to get wet, to start, you know, breeding colonies of mold. And yeah, it's certainly not great when you throw toxin into the mix that further amplify the ability for the mold to produce mycotoxins.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough to know where the line is. I guess it's kind of important, but at the end of the day, it's kind of you want to avoid it in general. Would you say, perhaps this is a good way to frame the question, if you made a house out of nothing but biological material with no toxins, such as wood, you made like some hut, and but you know you didn't make it well, and it gets damp and moldy, very moldy. Would that be an issue? Would it be as much of an issue? Would do you think it would just be fine because the mold is not toxic?
I think so. Molds don't only start producing mycotoxins when we're threatened by other like human created toxins, but they also start creating mycotoxins when threatened by just any other mold. And so two molds can start to compete, and as they impede on each other's terrain, they excrete mycotoxins, kind of, we call them mold farts, to start, you know, attacking and competing for that organic material, because they're you know, they want more for it and less for the other molds. So it would still be an issue. I think a lot of the other things is many years ago we were spending more time outside, and we were spending more time, you know, breathing fresher air, right? There's a much larger volume of air that's being circulated outside. And so the amount of spores would be typically generally lower. Um, yeah, and sunlight, oxygen, and other organic materials outside where there's less toxins also breeds a less pathogenic species of mold. So even though we're being exposed to molds outside and those, they are technically less pathogenic. But again, like you're saying, like creating a mud hut, well, that mud hut is also, even if it's wet, is going to have more air circulation, more oxygen, and that's going to impede the growth of pathogenic strains of mold like the aspergillus and the stachybotrys and those kinds of things. Although they can, some of them can still grow, but it's more an issue of like, we made homes airtight to comply with energy efficiency standards, but we didn't quickly enough start adding in the air exchange systems that continually refresh the air inside of the house and keep oxygen saturation levels there. I mean, just humans and pets and all of those things. And the more people you have in the house, the more CO2 you're generating. And in the winter when all the windows are shut and the doors are closed, this can further exacerbate the situation, where you're not getting circulation. And like, even like I said before with my personal scenario, if you're in an apartment and you have people on the other side and the HVAC system is shared throughout the whole house, you're sharing your air with that person. So if they're not maintaining their side, um, even if you're maintaining yours, I mean, even the HVAC system at the bottom could have humidity issues and have mold growing inside of the HVAC system. So that can be another challenge as well. But yeah, contrasting between older building techniques to now, we had things were way less airtight. Yeah.
Very good. We could talk about this much longer, but I would like to get to some other topics very quickly. Where should people go if they want to learn more about mold? I know Jordan Peterson did a really good podcast with Shoemaker, and who was the other gentleman? But maybe do you have somewhere in particular that they should go for, either from
Yeah,
yourself or other people?
Michaela Peterson, Jordan Peterson's daughter, she made
Yep.
I think it's like biotoxin.com or something.
Yep. Yeah, there's various good websites for it. I forget the names.
Yeah.
I think there's a 12-step protocol website as well, but
Yeah, is that Shoemaker's 12-step protocol?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, I find it interesting too, as like an acute treatment. I mean, basically just get yourself out of exposure. But I think minerals, fascinatingly, are a great way to enhance the body's own systems, and make yourself actually more resilient to mold exposure as well, while also healing from it. So very interesting, and could solve the problem for you once and for all. Although you'll still have to give some attention to fixing your interior environments. But perhaps we might touch on that later in our discussion.
yeah. Well, no, let's go into that. How so? Because I don't think we're going to hear that from anybody else. I haven't heard anybody else talk about. Uh, well, I've heard them talk about nutrition kind of being a band-aid for some people, and I think that can definitely be true, and I think somewhat for me it has been. But how do you see minerals coming into play here for helping people detoxify and be resilient against mold exposure?
Yeah, no matter what. I mean, yeah, nutrition can be a band-aid in certain contexts, but I think no matter what, it's imperative and important to improve your nutrition and be curious about what kind of foods could be better for your body. So, um, I mean, it's kind of, it can be a band-aid in certain contexts. But yeah, as we touch on minerals, I see the potential there for, in conjunction with Dr. Richie Shoemaker's protocol, perhaps, if we're still kind of touching on the subject of mold illness. um, I see it being more of a root contributing factor healer to what kind of created susceptibilities in the first place. You know, there are heavy metals, and I think very often we don't consider the fact that iron is actually a heavy metal, like mercury, arsenic, cadmium, and lead. It's really in the same category. The difference is that our body can actually use this heavy metal for many different processes, such as assembling the heme molecule and loading it into the red blood cell to carry oxygen around the body, or assembling the heme molecule to be used in neurotransmitter synthesis, that supports your cognition and your mood, right? Uh, this is like the pathology of how depression and anxiety and such occurs, is when we can no longer synthesize on demand neurotransmitters like GABA, dopamine, serotonin, which really also um, go into the production of things like noradrenaline and norepinephrine, which can regulate blood flow and blood pressure. And iron is connected to all of these things, but if we're not, we can correct an iron deficiency through good eating and the consumption of animal foods like red meat. But if our iron metabolism is still dysregulated, this touches on to many other dysfunctions at the level of the electron transport chain. So in the electron transport chain, in complex 3, the body is creating iron sulfur clusters. So it needs that heme molecule that it created in the porphyrin pathway, and to assemble that with sulfur to create the iron sulfur cluster that's going to donate electrons to, I believe, or accept electrons from CoQ10. And then through this goes on to the next um, electron transport chain step, complex 4, cytochrome C oxidase, which requires copper. And so you have this donation of electrons from iron sulfur clusters to complex 4, and that carries on to the other things in the electron transport chain. But these are some of these key minerals that need to be maintained, and copper just so happens to be involved in a lot of metabolic processes as far as iron goes. So if there's a deficiency in copper, which today is quite likely just due to the fact that we spray so much glyphosate on our crops, and glyphosate chelates copper at an affinity perhaps 1,000 times more than zinc. And so you can have this dysregulation between zinc and copper levels. And so now correcting a copper deficiency can be incredibly difficult. And histamine intolerances is deeply connected to this, because unbound iron in the blood can occur now because copper runs the enzyme known as, it's a protein, ceruloplasmin, created in the liver. And then ceruloplasmin is like the crane that loads the unbound iron into the transferrin carrier protein so that it can move around in the body and get to all the metabolic processes it needs to. And copper also, copper helps transfer and take iron into the bone marrow where red blood cells are made. And so, I'm sure you've heard of sickle cell anemia, which is, when the red blood cells are malformed, and you have just a lot of defective red blood cells, and you don't have good oxygen carrying capacity. But you can have very similarly looking types of anemia just from red blood cells not being properly formed with that heme molecule that ceruloplasmin and transferrin is involved with. So this copper deficiency now starts to create all of these other symptoms, which could be so many other different diseases, and it could be so confusing to the average person or the average doctor even, that it never gets solved ever. And you go your entire life with what looks like perhaps an iron deficiency, and it could just be impaired copper. Now, in many of your videos, you go over the connection between low iron but also low cholesterol um, in this whole social justice warrior phenomena, and the pale skin and the bruising and the dark eyes. And I think in this case you're right to assume that there is perhaps an iron deficiency, because there just is a complete avoidance of iron containing foods. And we know that iron in vegetables is far less bioavailable, so there's a lot less absorption of iron. And so it does get fairly complicated, and in the context of someone's been eating vegetables for years that have been sprayed with glyphosate, then not only are they iron deficient, they're also copper deficient. So even when they've basically just traded one problem for another, they've upgraded from an iron deficiency, and now you've upgraded them to iron dysregulation. Now that can be almost just as bad as a problem because now iron, being a heavy metal, increases reactive oxygen species in the body, feeds pathogens like viruses, fungi, and parasites. And you have this issue of perhaps MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome, and histamine intolerance from this whole cascade occurring. And it can take a little while to solve this, but perhaps in the case of someone who hasn't been eating any iron, obviously a good step is going to be to, like, okay, start eating some meat. And if you don't feel better, well then um, make sure you're getting all your key trace minerals with that meat too, because copper isn't the only, it by no means is a silver bullet. We require all of the trace minerals. So, boron, we need boron to retain copper. We need manganese to regulate electrolytes. And, we need selenium to come in there, and molybdenum to help, clear and create glutathione, and manganese, which helps to take. So our body can create a lot of superoxide in certain scenarios, just from certain metabolic processes. And copper and manganese run superoxide dismutase enzymes. So basically, just the enzyme that transforms superoxide into hydrogen peroxide. And hydrogen peroxide can also cause issues once we start increasing copper and manganese. So we still haven't solved the problem. So now, if someone has been avoiding taking vitamin C for an oxalate issue, you know, now all of a sudden your gut barrier might be more intact, and you might not be absorbing as many oxalate issues. So now that your oxalate issue is perhaps solved, you might be able to start intaking some supplemental vitamin C again, so you can deal with that superoxide issue that you've created. So this is why holistic healing and things is so cumbersome and so often avoided, because we're just trading one problem for another. But essentially is we're just taking toxins through multiple conversion steps. And so what vitamin C is going to do, so let's start back again at, so we took copper and manganese to reduce the amounts of superoxide in our body. Now we have a hydrogen peroxide issue. So now we need the antioxidants to come in and transform this hydrogen peroxide into simple water and oxygen. So once you uncouple that, you create water and oxygen. And so there's an enzyme in this process that's important. And I just want to take a quick look at some genetics here, just so I cover it correctly in the glutathione pathway. So it's an enzyme called catalase. And again, here's where heme comes into play, is we need heme to run catalase. And this can reduce hydrogen peroxide to water and oxygen. And aluminum and heavy metals and cyanide can really inhibit catalase. Um, yeah, and it really seems like vitamin C can actually just directly supplement, and vitamin C can make up for a slow catalase enzyme. Um, and so in this whole system, um, hydrogen peroxide can also be reduced with glutathione. So taking things like riboflavin that recycles glutathione, vitamin C protects glutathione, manganese and glycine are involved in the synthesis of glutathione. And so glutathione is the master antioxidant. And so it just comes in, it can clean up and make up for deficiencies in other nutrients too, in some respects. And glutathione is the main pathway from which you're going to even detoxify mold, and that. So just supporting some of the body's endogenous systems can do a lot, rather than artificially prompt the body to, do more things by taking something that's almost like a hormone or a steroid, like vitamin A, or eating lots of vegetables with polyphenols, and taking supplemental polyphenols like resveratrol and quercetin and all of these things that really, they supplement functions that the body can already take care of, and really it's just a mix of, okay, let's, rather than attacking the invader in the body and taking um you know things like oregano and like killers like and biocides and all of these things, why don't we just enhance our body's ability to create its own master antioxidants that take care of things itself, rather than eating all of these and thinking that we need all these antioxidants in plants. um yeah.
That was a very good description of the biochemical pathways, and I really appreciate it. For people who maybe struggle to follow with that, we zoom out a bit and maybe give a few uh, wider view steps of what would benefit those things, maybe particular nutrients to supplement or to start with supplementing before they start with other ones, and then perhaps just some general dietary guidelines, or I guess toxin, staying away from toxins could be another category, but just some general zoomed out guidelines. What do you think?
Yeah, that was a lot of stuff, and perhaps a lot of word vomit for the uninitiated. And zooming out and appreciating the bigger picture, I think just simply feeding like an ancestral diet, something that includes a lot of the rich quality amino acids found in ruminant animal meats. And these are, they contain like all of a broad range and a balanced intake of all of these amino acids that actually makes it more absorbable and utilizable in the body. So like leucine, carnitine, of course we've got choline, which is actually kind of referred to as a B vitamin in a way. um, Creatine, obviously huge, and taurine, super big in animal foods that are important for running the body's detoxification pathways. And then you've just got like your general fats that can be used as a fuel source, but are really just there to create and protect cell membranes and make sure you got your cholesterols and fats to be able to create your bile and digest that and get your fat soluble nutrients and vitamins. And really in the broader picture of fats, we understand that ancestrally we would have never been eating more than like 5% of our calories from omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. So in the animal foods and in whole plants and nuts and seeds, which we wouldn't have really eaten that much of, we never would have been getting more than 5 to 7% of our calories from polyunsaturated fats like omega-6. And so really like just a moderate amount of monounsaturated and saturated fats in your diet from whole sources, great. And then when we appreciate that, carbohydrates can act as our main fuel source, and they burn a little bit cleaner than fats do and create, less smoke and reactive oxygen species than fats do as we burn them for fuel. Some of the cleanest carbohydrates in my understanding of biology are, the white rices, basmati rice, um, and avoiding like the brown rices that can contain higher levels of arsenic. If you can tolerate the white potatoes, I know like peeling them and pressure cooking them can make them a lot more digestible. And these starches really are just strings of pure glucose that can be metabolized in any cell of the body, and places a little bit less stress on the liver than fruit sources that have sugars like fructose. Um, but if you're still in good health and you want to use fruits to as a means of hydrating your body quite well, then there certain genetic variations can also affect our ability to metabolize fructose. Some people might have a much steeper climb in triglycerides from the consumption of fructose than someone else, and it's really like you can look at some of these genetics through from a whole genome sequencing, but really triglycerides won't affect you as much if you're highly physically active and your liver's in good health. Um, so, as someone would go about healing their liver, they might be able to metabolize a little bit more fructose, but always listen to your body, listen to its signals. And as far as your hydration goes, if you're not going to be consuming enough fruit, make sure you're hydrating yourself enough, and you're supplementing at least with some magnesium and potassium, so that you're getting your electrolytes.
Good. Okay, so getting a complete source, just to summarize, a good complete source of amino acids from meat, uh, getting enough fat and cholesterol from the meat as well, but you don't have to go overboard on it. A good source of carbohydrates, particularly starches. And is there anything else? Just quickly summarize for that.
Yeah, like that's as far as like whole sources go. And then like some people, if they're healing from a chronic disease state or healing from mold exposure, or healing from just a generally nutrient deficient diet from decades of exposure to foods containing glyphosate, um, all of these people, and I think just generally, even those not exposed, might want to do some small amount of trace mineral supplementation. So if you can find a good trace mineral supplement, that might be good, but sometimes it might be best to source and create kind of your own by finding certain trace minerals that have been complex with amino acids, like glycine, for example. You'll see a lot of like supplements like copper glycinate or manganese glycinate, or
It's also
yeah,
glycine. Just be
bisglycinate
clear.
is essentially the same thing. Like, so a magnesium bisglycinate, and
Yeah.
all of these trace minerals will be way better absorbed into your body and utilized, and you'll be able to take smaller amounts and not overwhelm your body's metabolism. And so, glycine, of course, is an awesome amino acid for these trace minerals to be chelated to, because a lot of the pathways that they're involved in also utilize glycine. And glycine balances out methionine. It's one of the collagenous amino acids that are present in collagenous tissues. And so it helps rebuild skin barriers, gut barriers, and blood brain barriers to reduce uh, brain fog. And so, yeah, I mean, just as we appreciate the power of amino acids, especially ones like glycine that we all just tend not to get enough of, even supplementing with glycine can be great. And creatine can also help us conserve metabolic processes that can help us produce more choline, because we need choline for our bile, and then we digest our food better, and then we don't need to eat as much. It
Mhm.
just works more efficiently.
Very good. Maybe somewhat selfishly, but I'll ask you about glycine and vitamin C because, as you were mentioning, some people with oxalate issues, both vitamin C and glycine can convert into oxalate. And that's something that I struggle with. And it's like a never ending fight to find the right balance for me. With vitamin C, I honestly I struggle to figure out what to do these days, but I'll try various different fruits in just very small amounts because it seems I only need a little bit of it to be good. But pretty much any fruit I try isn't it will give me various different issues. And so I hopefully most people aren't in this situation and they can just either have high vitamin C fruit or just take a vitamin C pill and be fine. But for people that have oxalate issues and really struggle with any amount of vitamin C, it seems, and glycine too, because I've taken glycine and I noticed it helped me fall asleep more quickly. And that was good. But then I'll maybe revisit taking smaller amounts, but even relatively small amounts will give me oxalate issues. Same thing with vitamin C. Uh, do you have anything? Do you have any knowledge on that, perhaps, with because you're very good with the biochemical pathways, with how that could be reduced, even in somebody who's taking very small amounts still?
No, no, that's very interesting. And like at the same time, your question is like connecting different neurons from different places in my brain. So it's like, yeah, it's a very interesting question. So glycine and vitamin C can also increase oxalates. So I actually wasn't aware of the connection between glycine and oxalates, but it's interesting. It's perhaps like, is oxalate just like a byproduct of something, or something's misfolded, or like, you know,
The way
because
I understand it is that it, I guess, most people, their metabolism converts some things into oxalate. Some people make a lot of oxalate endogenously, and they're endogenous producers. Obviously, you can consume oxalate exogenously from high oxalate foods, but then some people also will not metabolize glycine and vitamin C in a preferable way, or however they metabolize it, they turn a lot of it into oxalate. So I don't know if everybody turns vitamin C into oxalate or if only some people do, but either way, people with oxalate issues tend to have difficulties, especially with very high vitamin C. But maybe it's just because I'm very observant, self-observant, and aware of my body, but I notice it even with
yeah, no, no, that's good. I think, I'm going to take a stab at trying to create a good hypothesis just on the fly here. And I think that, you might be able to take this a little bit further as you research. So I understand from some investigations in how enzymes function is that if you take a certain nutrient and it can't be metabolized through the pathway it's generally supposed to be metabolized through, it can go on to do other things that might be a little bit more nefarious. And so, in our body, we're always balancing oxidation, like so pro-oxidation and antioxidation. And so, if there's nothing for the vitamin C to clean up, and there's no hydrogen peroxide for it to go and clean up, then, it might go on to do something more nefarious. And then in the case of glycine, is that, if the cofactors for glycine, which, we don't necessarily consider as cofactors for glycine, but it's cofactors in the metabolism of glycine in various pathways. So glycine is traditionally metabolized in the glutathione pathway, and it's combined with cysteine and it's combined with glutamic acid. Now, I don't think you would be deficient in either of those, cysteine or glutamic acid, as you already subsist on a fair portion of ruminant animal meat. So you're going to be getting enough of both of those amino acids. And many people actually are, even non-carnivores, are going to be still getting quite a bit of cysteine. and possibly enough glutamic acid as well. And we can produce some of these inside of our body as well. We can actually produce our own glycine as well, but it's rarely enough, and it's expensive for the body to produce its own uh, non-essential amino acids, right? So it uses up a lot of ATP to run those enzymatic processes. So, like, getting back to glycine and its involvement in the glutathione pathway, is that manganese is very important for the metabolism of being able to get glycine through, and for GCC, the enzyme or glutathione synthetase, or whatever, the enzyme that creates glutathione. So that requires manganese and glycine to come in, and then it uses that, and then it creates glutathione with cysteine and glutamic acid. So if there's a deficiency in manganese, which most people are, because glyphosate also chelates manganese from our foods, maybe not as much of an extent as it does copper, but it still does. So I'd say broadly we're manganese deficient, but we also have trouble even metabolizing manganese if we're deficient in copper. So when our body, I don't know if you've tested your iron levels, if you've done the full Monty iron panel, ferritin, transferrin saturation, and
I think
blood
I just
serum.
put my ferritin, and I think it was about 200.
Yeah, last time I checked about a year ago, I was roughly around the same area, around 200. And 200 could certainly be an issue for the metabolism of copper and manganese. And I actually haven't made this recommendation before, but I'm imagining on the fly right now, just like if someone is having trouble metabolizing copper and manganese, before starting to ingest those minerals, it might be a good idea to somehow reduce your iron intake, or take some form of something that can chelate iron. And the best example of this, it's a bit expensive though, it's called lactoferrin.
Yeah.
So if you're able to tolerate raw dairy, also, like, going along some of Ray Pete's teachings is like using calcium to balance phosphorus as well. So you're kind of killing a few birds with one stone here. Raw milk containing lactoferrin, whenever you consume red meat, can help block iron absorption for you, to kind of get those iron levels down in preparation to kind of start intaking some copper and manganese, because those two, just like, they create a lot of problems when we have a lot of iron in our body. And you certainly wouldn't be alone in this scenario. There are a lot of people, not even carnivorous, that are iron dysregulated. So just like a really high ferritin, and just generally iron overloaded. No, of course, this isn't the case in social justice warriors with pale skin, but in people who are, I mean, nothing against, it was a complex scenario created by propaganda and increased inflammation and toxins in our food. So I'm not saying it's your fault for being a social justice warrior.
Yeah.
Exactly. But just like, we have this broad iron overload, generally just because we are heavy metal overload. If we've been exposed to mercury amalgam fillings, or arsenic in our food, or letting cadmium in chocolates, um, and just generally heavy metals and aluminum. And then fluoride is a huge one in our drinking water. The only thing that can remove fluoride from our drinking water is reverse osmosis or distillation. And so, who isn't getting exposed to fluoride? Very, very few people. And fluoride also chelates copper, impairs, function of many enzymes. It's a neurotoxin. It doesn't actually help with bones and teeth long term, although it might harden them short term. like there's a lot of research out on this. I don't know why we're still poisoning billions of people with fluoride, but
Yeah.
it's still happening. But like again, like all of this is going to feed into a circle that creates something that looks like iron deficiency in someone who might actually have enough iron. So I mean, again, there is going to be some cases of people legitimately being iron deficient, but a lot of people who are generally consuming enough iron are really just having a iron metabolism issue. And I'm, to this day, you know, I haven't checked my ferritin in a little while, but I would gauge that I still have somewhat of an iron metabolism issue, and as I heal my liver and heal from certain heavy metal exposures, then eventually my iron metabolism will improve. Um, but yeah, it's certainly complex, and I like to refer to it as like this network. There's no one root cause. It's like this network of contributing factors that's damaging liver and kidneys and the brain, which impairs like a parasympathetic mode of living. So high stress and the vagus nerve doesn't pulse the digestion correctly, and just so many issues. But
Maybe one more thing, another topic that we could hit is you taught me this word, agnotology, and I had never heard it before. But could you explain what that means and how this fits into all the topics that, well, not perhaps not all the topics, but many of the topics that we've discussed? Because it's pretty interesting.
yeah, I mean, I briefly touched on it, and I thought it fascinating just because of our current culture. And what I believe is we have so many valid solutions for the problems we're facing today, but they've been buried underneath so much ignorance and misinformation that we can hardly discern truth from fiction or extract signal from noise. And this, this is this breeding of this agnotology is we have this very deliberate effort now from the powers that be to sway us from these truths and to pull us as far away from uh, getting to these very cheap and effective ways of empowering our health, um, really tearing families apart and poisoning people. And it's insidious, and it's like everyone who claims that you know I think there's just a growing proportion of people who are using the Dunning-Kruger effect explanation to shy away from questioning and being curious about the truth. And so, bring up the Dunning-Kruger effect, but really it's just a fear of really getting to the bottom of what's really affecting us, right? It's this purposeful ignorance because we want to live life under this veil that protects us from certain grim realities. But I mean, like the more we do that, the more we perpetuate this disease state and this ignorance. And it's going to cause a significant amount of division among the population. And well, it already is, but the division is only so we're coming to like this fork in the road. And unfortunately, I'm still trying to come up with ways to diffuse the polarity between people, but it's going to very quickly escalate as things start to become discovered. People are going to be pitted to one side and the other, um, as we grapple with this agnotology, this ignorance. We will either turn away to the truth or look to the truth and perhaps this may dismay some, but I mean, ultimately, if the truth is what you seek and you're curious, um, you're, weirdly enough to say, you're gonna be okay. Um, but it's this strange phenomena that seems to be polarizing, polarizing us away from healing, away from our purpose, away from, yeah, it's strange.
What would you say is the fundamental difference between people who are curious and wishing to know and to not be ignorant, and those who are kind of more willfully ignorant? Would it, I would posit that it's a lot to do with physical health and making it somewhat of a vicious cycle. Like the less healthy you are and the worse your brain works, to be quite frank. Like if you're malnourished, your brain's not going to work as well as it should. It's exceedingly difficult to grapple with nuances and to wrestle with those things. And the less energy our brain has, the more it will just resort to simplifying things and not grappling with the nuance. Do you see that as well, or do you see another factor that's more pertinent?
No, I know that's really interesting that you touch on energy. It's like it's an energy deficiency that's leading us
Really,
this to
like
simplify things.
when you don't have enough energy, it you can't you can't play. You can't let ideas come into your head without fear that they will infect you. Very similarly to how we understand like physical infections. If if you were not, I don't know if intelligent is like the only word or the best word to describe it, but if you're not, if your if your brain isn't well nourished enough and you're not intelligent enough, then you're better off not letting foreign ideas come into your mental framework to play with and to test, because they might infect you and they might take hold. Whereas if you are more, let's just say, mentally resilient in this way, then you can take in different foreign ideas from all sorts of people. And chances are the idea is bad, because most ideas are bad ideas. But if you take in these ideas and you can play with them and you can take it apart and keep what you wish to keep and throw away what is no good for you and try things out without fear of it killing you or parasitizing you. Whereas if you are weaker, you are more vulnerable to these foreign threats.
No, that's a really agile explanation of the situation. And like again, as you point to energy deficiency, but like, like is it the energy deficiency that bred to the lack of intelligence that allowed for you to make your own independent and critical decision making? Maybe. And that was a really good summary of kind of the situation that's going on. Is like we have people who are so energetically and mentally deficient, depraved, and so like, as you talk about the parasitization and, like the kind of fear that sets in, like everything that has the risk of offending you, you know will create some form of fear. And the mental deficit, perhaps just the bioenergetic deficit, leads you, again, like you're saying, to not want to play in that sandbox of ideas. So it kind of limits you. It limits your creativity and your ability to make independent decisions. Because like everyone wants to like kind of believe that it was their idea to begin with. Like I'm not sure how exactly this phenomena develops, or if it's just kind of part of the ego. And it's like, the whole like the film of Inception, and how like you plant the idea in someone's head, but it's like we all want to really believe that our ideas are our own, when really we're we're inventing and off someone else's ideas, and we're being inspired by each other and being inspired by each other's ideas. But like we all just want to like believe that like, oh, I came up with this myself, but like really it's like I read a stack of books from all of these people that inspire me, or like I went to their blog, or I spoke with Brendan, or like we're just like we're all in like this kind of state of play. And it's like I think the more we shut down our own ego and give credit to other people's creative thinking, then we open ourselves up, kind of like what you alluded to, this state of play where we have the energy to allow these ideas to come into us and influence our psyche, because we don't have the fear that we're going to be like necessarily changed by them. But like, we're also, like you said, we're open to taking a part of it and changing ourselves with it, or changing our thinking, if we can find something in it. But if that fear is there, then we might just reject the whole idea, or throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah, the degree to which you're weak and vulnerable is the degree to which you tend to be anxious, because you need to be more anxious, because the world is a more threatening place if you're weaker and more vulnerable. Randy Thorhill, he's a professor and scientist, and what's it called? Parasite stress theory of values. And he found that there was a very high correlation between parasite load and, I guess, immune response, or how unhealthy people were, and their political attitudes basically towards authoritarianism. And the more sick and the more loaded they were with parasites, and not just worms and stuff, but, as you know, like, bacterial and viral parasites, the more sick they were, the more likely they were to be authoritarian, because they are more vulnerable to other people, right? And like, evolutionarily, if you're in a small group of people and you are weak and vulnerable to infection, you need to be careful about those people over the hills coming over and getting you sick, right? Or even just physically hurting you, right? And I think it has transitioned more to a mental landscape, because what used to be very important was your physical health. Like, if you lost your physical health, you were done, right? If you broke a leg, or if you got horribly sick, right, that was bad news bears. But now it's more of an issue of mental health, because our economy is just so much more mentally run, right? And so I think that now I don't know if it's an immune response, but we have more of a response to ideas than we do to physical characteristics, right? There's less xenophobia of physical attributes, and more, there still is that xenophobia, but there's more xenophobia towards ideas that are different from you, because I think we're in this more psychological economy, and mental health is more important, if that makes sense.
Yes. Very interesting discussion. I almost like this discussion more than the beginning part of this interview, and it's like another 5-hour conversation.
Yeah,
It's
we can talk about this another time, because I know.
absolutely
Yeah.
fascinating. And I love your spin on things. Like, what's your background? What did you study growing up? What are some of your key influences and inspirational thought leaders that you read?
Man, just like being unhealthy and then getting healthy was like the main thing. Like, I mean, I studied physical health education, but I hardly learned much with that degree. I mean, with most university degrees, I've learned a lot more just out of my own curiosity, which I think is true for most people. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I've definitely learned a lot from a lot of different people, and but for myself, paying very close attention to myself and my own symptoms, and how, because I kind of explain this in some of the videos, like, I used to be that social justice warrior type person. I used to be like that, not severely, but enough. And what made the difference between thinking more calmly and more traditionally, to be honest, I'm not saying that one's better than the other, but uh, it was just a matter of physical health, and realizing that, I was like, and I've also had some crazy experiences with mental health and nutrition, and but that's a whole other thing. Like, I've had some unbelievable experiences with poor mental health. I know what it's like to be very poor in health physically and mentally, but I also know what it's like to be quite good physically and mentally, and I the whole spectrum in between. And I know I have a pretty good understanding of what makes those differences between good and bad physical health. But yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I think we should definitely talk some more sometime about a whole bunch of different topics, really.
Yeah, it looks like we have a lot of points of interest here in common that we could discuss. I look
Okay.
forward to it. And,
Yeah, well, I
we'll
really
get
appreciate your
together today.
understanding, and you have both an incredible nuanced understanding of the fine details and the biochemical pathways, but you also, unlike a lot of people who are strong in that, you also have a very good understanding of when we zoom out, what does that look like holistically, and you don't get trapped in that zoomed in looking under the microscope view. And it's rare, and I'm always happy to talk to people like that. So
Thank you. I really appreciate that comment, and I see a lot of that, very same thing in you. So likewise.
thank you. Okay, well, that was nice. Nathaniel, have a good rest of your day. Talk
You as
later.
well, Brendan.
Thanks.